I recently realized there hasn't been a proper, fully scripted Game Rants episode since April, and frankly, that's a shameful display, especially when Game Rants is my favorite series to produce by far. What better way is there to bring the beloved series back to the forefront after a 3-month drought than to piss off everybody? Doing otherwise would naturally fly against true Fringy spirit, of course. Now, if you're a long-time viewer of mine, you know how I feel about the goddamn console war. If time is space, even black holes don't consume as much shit as the useless endeavor of arguing for a corporation over a box. A box! It's a magnet for stupidity, and where stupidity congregates, my blood pressure rises. And as we all know, the best way to alleviate frustration is through getting angry. The PS4's lifetime sales have just surpassed 25 million units, which means the console is well on its way to outselling the PS2. You would think the reasonable reaction to that news would either be, okay, or that's cool. No, that would be too reasonable. And as we all know, reasonableness to gamers is like a picture of Sarah Jessica Parker to an erect cock. It just doesn't happen. Look, the news itself is a big deal for sure. As is the case with most gaming-related statistics, it sheds light on the popularity of the console. They matter, and nobody can say otherwise, but they also don't exist in a vacuum. When people argue exclusively over hardware sales, they're foolish. And people who simply say the PS4 has won the generation or is a massive success due to the hardware sales alone are either profoundly ignorant or retarded. So for context sake, I'm going to give you a brief overview of how the console market works financially. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but for those of you who aren't, here's a brief rundown. Consoles are typically sold at a loss for the first few years that they're on the market. This generation is no exception. We know for a fact that the Wii U and Xbox One was sold at a loss, and personally that $381 to manufacture a PS4 figure still suggests to me that the console was sold at a loss because manufacturing costs are not the only costs associated with creating and selling a product. Make no mistake, this is a deliberate choice on the part of console manufacturers. If the whole console gaming is cheaper than PC bullshit indicates anything, it's that people are willing to pay more money long term if the upfront cost is lower. That's why consoles are sold at a loss for the first few years. Not just because people are stupid, but because it makes sense fiscally. If these consoles were being sold at a profit, there would literally be no reason to buy a console over a gaming PC. The goal of consoles is to provide consumers with the most powerful hardware at the cheapest possible entry price. This may seem irrelevant, but trust me, this is important to know. So when we know this to be true, in the scheme of a company's financials, hardware sales alone are actually detrimental. Sure, in terms of being numbers on a sheet, it's great, but that doesn't mean anything if the product is actually costing the company money. You don't need to be a financial analyst to figure out that Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo are making their profits elsewhere. At least before paying for features that should be free became a thing, that place was and still is software sales. Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo generate revenue off every single title sold on their platform, exclusive or not. In the console market, the bulk of revenue is generated in software sales, and so, if we're looking at gaming financially or from the perspective of people who want to see a faceless corporate entity succeed, software sales matter more than console sales. On a $60 retail console game, developers get screwed, but that's more of a rant for why DLC is running rampant. Part of that has to do with the split of revenue. The retailer gets about $12 and the console manufacturer gets about $12. So every game sold generates money for the company simply because it's on their platform. You multiply that number with the raw software sales on platforms and you can see that's a lot of money for very little effort. There's a reason why Valve are raking in mountains of cash. They're not selling shit in their service for free of charge out of the good of their hearts. Every game sold on Steam generates revenue for Valve, except they've got it better because PC gamers buy more games, digital games make more money, and they're not selling consoles. But you don't need me to explain why PC gaming is better for everybody. I'm sure some of you are wondering, so what's the point you're trying to make? I'm saying when you're evaluating the success of a console, don't think so rigidly and actually use your brains. Now, even with this in mind, the PS4 is doing better than the Xbox One. Even proportionately speaking, games sell better on the PS4. Christ, Arkham Knight on the PS4 tripled the sales seen on the Xbox One. So yes, the PS4 is winning out of the consoles, but relative victory is also equally worthless. Hardware sales mean jack shit if games aren't selling up to par, and with game budgets at an all-time high, modern releases selling about as well as their past counterparts is not something to cheer about. especially if you're going around boasting about hardware sales when publishers and developers don't care about hardware sales if their games aren't selling. I could go on about that, but that's another rant for another day. All I'm saying is hardware sales are not a metric for the success of a platform fiscally. Last time I checked, the PS3 outsold the 360, but if you were to come up to me and say the PS3 was a success, you'd be a fucking liar. Meanwhile, back in the 90s, nobody could say the Genesis was a failure compared to the SNES, simply because the SNES beat it in hardware sales. Both consoles sold games, which is something both the PS4 and Xbox One are struggling to achieve, as is evident by the closure of studios and the advent of DLC and pre-order content. Even this shit doesn't really matter when determining the success of a console. I thought the quality of the games and the experiences mattered more. Did when I was a kid, nobody could say the GameCube sucked, and that thing sold at 1/8 as many units as the PS2. And the PS2 was amazing, not for the fact that it sold fantastically, but because it had great games. But this is modern gaming, so fuck me, right?